Karen threatened my pregnant wife over parking. He is now serving 5 years in jail. The megaphone crackled in Diane Wexler's hand as she screamed at my 8 months pregnant wife in our own driveway. "Move that car or I'm calling a tow truck right now," she shrieked, veins bulging in her forehead like an overinflated balloon. My wife, Sarah, gripped her belly and backed toward the porch, tears welling up in her eyes. That night, sitting in a cold interrogation room, I finally understood how far one woman's cruelty could go. But to explain how we got here, I have to take you back 6 months, to the day we moved into Brookhaven Estates. My name is Marcus Doyle, 34, a structural engineer, and Sarah is a second-grade teacher who lights up any room she enters. We'd saved for 4 years to afford our first home, a modest colonial with a wraparound porch in suburban Ohio. The neighborhood looked like a postcard: manicured lawns, white picket fences, and a community pool shimmering under summer sun. We didn't know yet that Brookhaven's real currency wasn't property value, it was fear, dispensed daily by one woman. Diane Wexler, HOA president for 11 consecutive years, greeted us on move-in day with a clipboard instead of a welcome basket. "Rule 12, she said, tapping her pen against our mailbox. "Non-regulation color. You'll need to repaint within 30 days. Sarah laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke. Diane did not smile back. Within a week, we received our first official violation notice, taped aggressively to our front door instead of mailed. Our neighbor Tom, mowing his lawn, caught my eye and mouthed silently, "Good luck." I later learned Tom's silence was earned the hard way: 3 years of fines over a garden gnome. Diane's husband, a retired judge named Harold Wexler, sat on the HOA board too, rubber stamping every decision she made. Together they ran Brookhaven like a fiefdom, deaf to any resident who dared question their authority. Still, we tried to be good neighbors. We repainted the shutters. We trimmed the hedges exactly to her specification. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough for Diane Wexler. She began patrolling the streets nightly in her golf cart, flashlight in hand, hunting for infractions like a bounty hunter. One evening she photographed our garbage cans, insisting they were 4 inches over the permitted curb distance. I almost laughed until I saw the fine, $200, due within 10 business days. Sarah, newly pregnant and exhausted, begged me to just pay it and avoid conflict. So I did. That was my first mistake. Compliance, I would learn, only whetted Diane's appetite for control. Weeks later, she cited us for excessive holiday decor, a single strand of lights Sarah hung for her birthday. I started keeping a folder. Every notice, every timestamp, every photo Diane took without permission went inside it. My cousin, a paralegal, told me, "Document everything. HOAs love bullying people who don't know their rights." That single sentence changed the entire direction of my life. Diane, meanwhile, grew bolder, holding emergency meetings to publicly shame residents who fell behind on landscaping standards. She once forced an elderly widow, Mrs. Alvarez, to remove a wheelchair ramp, calling it an unsightly modification. I watched Mrs. Alvarez cry at that meeting and felt something shift inside my chest, quiet, cold, determined. I began attending every HOA meeting, recording audio, taking notes, learning the bylaws better than Diane herself. She noticed. "You're awfully interested in procedure, Mr. Doyle," she said, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "Just a curious homeowner," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the anger simmering underneath. Little did she know, curiosity was about to become her worst enemy. The real war started over something absurdly small, a single guest parking spot in front of our own house. Sarah's mother was visiting to help prepare the nursery and her car sat there for 2 days. Diane knocked on our door at 7 in the morning, megaphone already in hand, though the street was empty. "This is a violation of visitor parking policy," she bellowed, loud enough for the whole cul-de-sac to hear. Sarah, still in her robe, tried explaining the situation calmly. Diane refused to lower her voice. "I don't care if she's your mother or the Queen of England, move it or I'm towing it." Neighbors peeked through curtains. Someone's dog barked. My pregnant wife stood there, humiliated, shaking. I rushed outside just as Diane jabbed a finger toward Sarah's belly. That baby better not slow down compliance either. Something in me snapped, but I stayed silent, pulling out my phone and hitting record instead of yelling back. Get that camera out of my face. Diane snarled, swatting at my hand. That swat, caught clearly on video, would become the first thread in a much larger unraveling. Sarah's mother left in tears, apologizing for a situation she hadn't caused, promising never to visit again. That night, Sarah sobbed into my shoulder. Why does she hate us so much, Marcus? What did we do? I didn't have an answer then. I only knew I would find out everything about Diane Wexler. The next morning, a tow truck actually arrived, hooking Sarah's mother's car despite her having already left the property. Diane had falsely reported it as abandoned, a claim that would later prove to be her undoing. I paid the release fee, seething, but calm on the surface. Calm was becoming my new weapon. That week, I filed a public records request for every HOA financial statement from the last 5 years. Buried in an obscure line item, I found something odd: recurring payments to a company called Wexler Property Solutions. I froze. Wexler. Same last name as Diane and Harold. Coincidence seemed unlikely. I mentioned it to Tom, my neighbor, who went pale. Nobody's ever looked at those records before, he whispered. Why not? I asked. He glanced around before answering, because everyone who tried got run out of the neighborhood. That warning only fueled my resolve further. I wasn't going anywhere. I contacted a real estate attorney, Rachel Kim, who specialized in HOA disputes and consumer protection law. Send me everything you have, she said. This sounds like more than just an overzealous board president. Rachel's office smelled like old paper and strong coffee, a fitting backdrop for the mountain of documents I'd gathered. This company, Wexler Property Solutions, she said, scanning invoices, has billed the HOA over $80,000 this year alone. For what services? I asked. Rachel shrugged. The invoices just say landscaping consultation and maintenance oversight. That's vague enough to hide almost anything, she muttered, circling several entries in red pen. Meanwhile, Diane escalated her campaign against us, now claiming our newly installed baby swing violated playground equipment restrictions. Sarah, 7 months pregnant, had to physically remove it herself while Diane supervised, arms crossed, smirking the whole time. You people think rules don't apply to you, Diane sneered, loud enough for passing joggers to hear. I began noticing a pattern: every fine against us seemed to appear right after I asked questions at meetings. It felt personal now, not procedural, like she wanted us gone before the baby ever arrived. Rachel warned me that retaliation against residents exercising legal rights could actually violate state HOA statutes. If we can prove intent, she said, this stops being annoying and starts being actionable. I started wearing a small recording pin whenever Diane approached our property, capturing everything on tape. One evening she cornered Sarah alone at the mailbox, unaware I was watching from our porch, recorder running. I know what you two are doing, Diane hissed. Digging around in things that aren't your business. We're just homeowners, Sarah replied, voice trembling but steady. Homeowners who'll regret it, Diane spat, before storming off toward her golf cart. That threat, recorded in full clarity, would later sit at the center of a criminal case file. I sent the recording to Rachel immediately. She replied within the hour, this is exactly what we needed. The next HOA meeting, Diane proposed a new bylaw specifically targeting excessive resident inquiries into board financial matters. Other residents, emboldened by our quiet resistance, began whispering questions of their own for the first time in years. Diane's grip on the room felt suddenly less absolute, though she masked it well behind practiced authority. Any resident who continues harassment of board members, she announced, will face immediate legal action from the HOA. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was threatening lawsuits while dodging questions about missing money. After the meeting, an older resident named Frank pulled me aside in the parking lot, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I served on the board 8 years ago, he whispered. Before Harold Wexler forced me out for asking about contracts. What happened to the contracts? I asked. Frank's face tightened. Everything went through a shell company. Nobody could trace it. Was it Wexler Property Solutions? I asked. Frank's eyes widened. How do you know that name? I explained what Rachel had found. Frank exhaled slowly. You're deeper into this than you realize, son. He agreed to testify if things ever escalated to court, on one condition: complete confidentiality until then. I promised, shook his hand and drove home with my mind racing through every possible angle. That night, Sarah went into early contractions, terrifying us both, though the doctors eventually stabilized things. Stress isn't good for the baby, the doctor warned gently. Try to reduce whatever's causing it. I looked at Sarah's exhausted face and felt a surge of guilt mixed with fury toward Diane Wexler. We're not backing down, Sarah said quietly from her hospital bed. Not after everything she's put us through. Her determination steadied me. We were in this together, whatever this was about to become. 2 days later, we returned home to find a new violation notice, this time for medical equipment visible from street. It referenced the pregnancy monitor delivery box still sitting on our porch, unopened, from that very morning. Diane had photographed it within minutes of the delivery truck leaving, timestamp proving she'd been watching constantly. Rachel later called this behavior a documented pattern of surveillance, a phrase that would matter enormously in court. I began cataloging every camera angle Diane might have used, realizing she'd installed cameras facing our property specifically. That discovery felt like ice water down my spine. This wasn't governance anymore. This was obsession. I filed a formal complaint with the county about unauthorized surveillance, attaching photos of her camera's clear angle toward us. The county sent a warning letter, which only enraged Diane further, escalating her tactics instead of curbing them. She began appearing at odd hours, sometimes just standing at the edge of our property, watching silently. Sarah started keeping the blinds closed permanently, afraid to feel Diane's eyes on her even inside her own home. I feel like we're being hunted, Sarah whispered one night, and I couldn't disagree with her. I doubled down on evidence gathering instead of retreating, meeting Rachel twice weekly to build our case methodically. We discovered Wexler Property Solutions was registered to Diane's sister, Patricia, in a neighboring state, a thin legal veil. Money flowed from HOA dues, through fake invoices, into Patricia's account, then back to Diane through unclear transfers. This isn't mismanagement, Rachel said grimly. This looks like embezzlement, plain and simple. We needed more proof though, bank records, sworn statements, something a prosecutor could actually use in court. Frank agreed to introduce me to 2 other former board members who'd been forced out under similar circumstances. Each one had a story eerily similar to mine: question the finances, get harassed, eventually leave the neighborhood entirely. One woman, Linda, still had emails from Harold threatening to make her life difficult if she pursued an audit. Those emails, preserved for 3 years out of stubborn spite, became another crucial piece of our growing case. Slowly, a picture emerged. Diane and Harold hadn't just bullied residents, they'd built a criminal enterprise disguised as governance. I felt something between vindication and dread. We were closer to the truth, but also deeper in danger. Diane, sensing resistance building, called an emergency meeting to reinforce her authority over the increasingly restless community. Certain residents, she announced without naming us directly, are spreading dangerous misinformation to undermine this board's integrity. I sat silently in the back row, recorder running, watching her dig her own grave one sentence at a time. Word spread quietly through Brookhaven that someone was finally standing up to Diane, and residents began approaching me discreetly. A young couple, the Hendersons, admitted they'd been fined for a trampoline Diane's own grandchildren used weekly, unfined. Double standards piled up fast once people started comparing notes instead of suffering silently in isolation. I created a private group chat, cautiously, inviting only residents Frank vouched for as trustworthy and quiet. Within days, we had 11 households sharing violation notices, photos and stories spanning nearly a decade of intimidation. Rachel reviewed everything and nearly dropped her coffee. Marcus, this is enough for a class action, not just a complaint. Sarah, now in her 9th month, insisted on attending the next meeting despite my concerns for her well-being. I want her to see my face, Sarah said firmly. I want her to know I'm not afraid anymore. That meeting, Diane arrived late, visibly rattled by whispers she couldn't quite make out from the crowd. I hear rumors, she announced, that certain troublemakers are trying to destabilize this community for personal reasons. Frank stood up, unprompted, voice shaking but clear. The only person destabilizing this community is you, Diane. Gasps rippled through the room. Nobody had ever spoken to her that directly in 11 years. Diane's face flushed crimson. You have no idea what you're talking about, Frank Delgado. I know about Wexler Property Solutions, Frank replied calmly, and the entire room fell dead silent. Diane's composure cracked for just a second, a flicker of panic before she rebuilt her mask of authority. That's a registered vendor, she snapped. Nothing illegal about hiring qualified contractors for community maintenance. Then you won't mind an independent audit, I said, standing up beside Frank, holding my folder high. Harold, sitting silently until now, suddenly stood. This meeting is adjourned. Effective immediately. But residents didn't leave. They stayed, murmuring, forming small clusters of quiet, furious solidarity against the board. That night marked the beginning of the end for Diane Wexler's reign, though none of us knew how quickly. 3 days later, Diane filed a restraining order against me, claiming harassment and stalking behavior. I was stunned. I hadn't approached her once outside official channels, always keeping careful, documented distance. Rachel reviewed the filing and shook her head. This is retaliation. Classic move to silence a whistleblower. We fought it in court, presenting our recordings, timestamps, and witness statements from Frank and Linda. The judge, reviewing the evidence, dismissed Diane's restraining order within 15 minutes, calling it wholly unsupported. Diane stormed out of the courthouse, refusing to make eye contact, her lawyer trailing behind apologetically. That legal defeat, small as it seemed, cracked something in her carefully maintained image of untouchable authority. Emboldened residents began attending county council meetings, demanding oversight into HOA financial practices across the district. A local reporter, Jenna Park, caught wind of the story and reached out, asking for an interview. I hesitated, worried about privacy, but Rachel encouraged transparency. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, she said simply. Jenna's article, published the following week, detailed Brookhaven's pattern of intimidation with our documented evidence as its backbone. The headline alone caused a stir: Suburban HOA president accused of running fear-based financial scheme. Diane issued a furious statement denying everything, calling the article defamatory lies from disgruntled homeowners. But the article included copies of actual invoices, timestamps, and Frank's on-record testimony, hard to dismiss as fiction. Local news picked up the story next, sending a camera crew to film outside Brookhaven's welcome sign. Diane refused to comment on camera, retreating behind closed blinds while reporters waited patiently outside her house. Meanwhile, Sarah went into labor 2 weeks early and we rushed to the hospital amid all this chaos. Our daughter, Emily, was born healthy at 3:47 in the morning, and for a few hours, nothing else mattered. Holding her tiny hand, I promised silently that Brookhaven would be safe before she ever crawled its sidewalks. We returned home 3 days later to find our lawn covered in fake "for sale" signs, clearly Diane's handiwork. Someone had also spray-painted "troublemakers" across our driveway overnight, a clumsy, desperate act of intimidation. Rachel filed a police report immediately, adding vandalism and harassment to the growing list of documented offenses. Detective Ramirez, assigned to the case, reviewed our entire folder and whistled low. "This is a lot, Mr. Doyle." "There's more," I said, handing over the financial records connecting Diane, Harold, and the shell company Patricia. Ramirez's eyes narrowed as he flipped through bank statements. "This looks like structured transactions. Possible money laundering." A forensic accountant was brought in, tracing funds through 3 different accounts across 2 states within days. The trail led back consistently to Harold Wexler's personal savings account, fattened suspiciously over 11 years. Meanwhile, Diane, unaware of the criminal investigation quietly building, doubled down on public defiance instead of caution. She called an emergency press conference on her own lawn, flanked by Harold, insisting the accusations were baseless jealousy. "These people," she said into the cameras, "simply can't accept that rules exist for a reason." Behind her, visible in the footage, was the exact camera angle we'd already proven watched our house illegally. Jenna Park asked pointedly, "Mrs. Wexler, can you explain the $80,000 paid to your sister's company?" Diane's face went white on live television. "No comment," she stammered, before Harold pulled her away hastily. That clip went viral within hours, residents across the country recognizing their own HOA nightmares in her expression. Detective Ramirez called me the next morning. "We're ready to execute a search warrant. Are you available to consult?" I watched from across the street as officers carried boxes of documents from the Wexler house, evidence bags in hand. Diane stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at me with a hatred that finally felt powerless. "This isn't over," she called out. I simply smiled and turned back toward my own front door. Weeks passed as the investigation deepened, uncovering years of falsified invoices and diverted maintenance funds. Then came the twist none of us anticipated. Patricia, Diane's sister, agreed to testify against her for immunity. She threatened to cut me off from the family if I didn't launder the money, Patricia admitted in her statement. It turned out Diane had manipulated her own sister for years, using guilt and financial dependency as leverage. Suddenly the woman who terrorized an entire neighborhood was revealed as someone who terrorized her own family first. Rachel called it the domino that broke the entire case wide open, and she wasn't exaggerating. With Patricia's testimony, prosecutors upgraded charges against Diane and Harold to include felony embezzlement and fraud. Meanwhile, the county HOA Oversight Board suspended Brookhaven's governing authority pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Residents, myself included, were finally free to breathe without fear of arbitrary fines or nightly surveillance patrols. But Diane wasn't finished yet. She appeared at our door one final time, megaphone conspicuously absent, voice trembling. "Please," she said, "just drop the complaint. I'll pay everything back. I'll leave the board." I looked at her, this woman who'd threatened my pregnant wife, and felt something surprisingly close to pity. "It's not up to me anymore," I said quietly. "The law doesn't offer refunds for what you've done." She left without another word, and I watched her walk away for what I assumed was the last time. 3 weeks later, the district attorney announced formal charges: embezzlement, fraud, harassment, and unlawful surveillance against Diane Wexler. Harold faced lesser charges but agreed to a plea deal in exchange for testimony against his wife. That betrayal, husband against wife, became the final twist nobody in Brookhaven had seen coming. "He always did whatever she told him," Frank remarked. "Guess self-preservation beats loyalty when prison's on the table." The trial began on a gray October morning, courtroom packed with residents who'd suffered under Diane's reign for years. Rachel represented our collective interests as witnesses, while the DA built a methodical case using our documented evidence. My recording of Diane threatening Sarah at the mailbox played for the jury, silence falling over the entire room. Several jurors visibly flinched at Diane's words on tape, homeowners who'll regret it. The prosecution called Linda, then Frank, then finally me, each testimony reinforcing a pattern impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Diane's lawyer tried painting us as vindictive neighbors with a grudge, but the financial evidence spoke louder. Patricia's testimony detailed exact dates and amounts, corroborated perfectly by the forensic accountant's independent findings. The defense's case crumbled further when Harold, under oath, admitted knowing about the falsified invoices from the start. "I told her it was wrong," he said, voice cracking, but she said the board would never question her. Diane sat rigid throughout, occasionally shaking her head, but her once commanding presence had visibly withered. Closing arguments took 2 full days, the prosecution emphasizing the pattern of intimidation against vulnerable residents, including a pregnant woman. This wasn't governance, the prosecutor told the jury. This was a woman who mistook a clipboard for a crown. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with verdicts on every single count against Diane Wexler. Guilty. 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 4 counts, one after another, each word landing like a physical blow. Diane's scream echoed through the courtroom, the same megaphone-trained voice now cracking with disbelief and rage. "This isn't justice," she shouted as bailiffs approached. "I built this community. I protected property values." Nobody in that courtroom believed her anymore. The mask had finally, completely fallen away. Sentencing came 6 weeks later. The judge cited a documented, sustained pattern of financial abuse and intimidation. 5 years in state prison, restitution exceeding $200,000 and a lifetime ban from HOA leadership roles. Harold received 18 months, suspended, due to his cooperation, along with mandatory community service and financial penalties. As bailiffs led Diane away in handcuffs, she caught my eye one final time across the courtroom. I felt no triumph in that moment, only exhausted relief that our daughter would grow up safely now. Sarah squeezed my hand tightly, Emily sleeping peacefully against her chest, unaware of the storm finally ending. Outside the courthouse, Jenna Park asked for a final statement. I kept it simple and honest. "We just wanted to raise our family in peace," I said. "Nobody should have to fight this hard for that." The Brookhaven HOA was placed under court-appointed management, tasked with returning stolen funds to residents over 18 months. Frank was elected interim president, promising transparency and term limits that Diane had conveniently avoided for over a decade. Linda finally got her long-overdue audit and every resident received partial restitution checks within the following spring. The Hendersons kept their trampoline. Mrs. Alvarez rebuilt her wheelchair ramp, this time with the board's official blessing. Our street, once patrolled nightly by a flashlight-wielding tyrant, felt quiet and ordinary again, in the best possible way. Sarah returned to teaching that fall, carrying Emily to school pickup lines without a single glance over her shoulder. I still keep that original folder, thick with violation notices, tucked safely in our garage as a reminder. Sometimes Emily will ask, years from now, why Daddy kept so much old paper in a cardboard box. I'll tell her it's proof that patience, evidence, and quiet courage can outlast even the loudest bully. Diane Wexler writes letters occasionally, forwarded through her lawyer, insisting she was misunderstood, never quite apologizing. I don't respond. Some debts aren't meant to be settled through correspondence, only through consequence already delivered. Patricia moved states away, rebuilding her life free from her sister's manipulation for the first time in decades. Harold, upon release from probation, sold his house quietly and left Brookhaven without a single goodbye to anyone. The community pool reopened that summer without a single new violation notice posted on anyone's door. Tom finally planted his garden gnome back in his front yard, right where Diane once forced him to remove it. We didn't win because we shouted louder than Diane Wexler. We won because we simply refused to stop documenting truth. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives quickly, but it arrives completely when patience meets undeniable evidence. Brookhaven Estates today looks like the postcard it always promised to be, except now, the promise is real. And somewhere in a state prison, Diane Wexler counts down 5 long years, finally answering to rules she never wrote herself.